Bobby Chesney, Director of the Strauss Center, and I want to thank you all for spending your time with us today, especially if you had to walk over here in the rain. Explain to Charlie, it rains every day in Texas always, and that's just how it goes around here. Charlie Savage, I could probably spend our entire allotted time describing how important he has been in the complex ecosystem of legal, policy, and journalistic issues that have surrounded the U.S. government's pursuit of its national security and foreign policy aims over the past decade and a half. But you're here to hear from him, not from me, so let me confine myself to saying just a few things. He's a Harvard grad who also has a master's from Yale Law School, which is a somewhat rare and special distinction amongst journalists who work on topics that intersect with legal issues in law and policy and lawyers. And that has helped enable him to become a very unique voice in American journalism, bringing the expertise of a sophisticated lawyer to bear on some of the most challenging legal questions we face. And you don't need me to tell you that legal issues have been at the center of counterterrorism policy and other legal issues, both in the Bush and now in the Obama administration. Charlie's been, I would say, by anyone's measure, the most important journalistic interrogator of this phenomenon and narrator of this phenomenon, synthesizer of the phenomenon. He's written a book previously called Takeover that took up this topic in the context of the Bush administration, and now, hot off the presses, comes Power Wars, which extends and deepens the story in connection with the Obama administration. It's more than 600 pages of extraordinarily detailed and resourced accounts that blend institutional analysis, personal dynamics, legal analysis, policy analysis, and weaves an almost bewildering array of different stories into certain common themes that I think he's going to share with us in a moment. So without further ado, let's welcome to the University of Texas, Charlie Savage.
Thanks, Bobby. Can everyone hear me okay? I think I have, yes? I just point out there are some seats in there if you want to be more comfortable for the next 45 minutes. I can see at least 2 or 3, 4 available ones. So I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes and then move to questions. I'd probably say the same thing in response to a question or as a canned presentation, but it seems to be more entertaining to do it as a lively give and take. And then we'll fill out the hour that way as long as you guys want to keep talking. Thanks very much, Bobby, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And let me just start by taking you back to January of 2009. President Obama is being sworn in. He's giving a speech about how there's going to be no more trade-offs between our values and our need to protect our security, no false choices. Bottles of water are falling. He says, and he, in very short order, issues executive orders that say that the government is going to get less secretive and be more transparent about what it's doing. It's going to shutter the prison at Guantanamo. It's shuttering the black site prisons the CIA has been running. There's going to be no more torture. And it seems, and all this happens in the course of 2 or 3 days. And it seems like the war on terror has just reached an end point. It's over now. And for someone like me, who had been covering these issues since 2003, been writing about Guantanamo and drones and targeted killing and secrecy and surveillance and leak investigations eventually and so forth, it was a bewildering moment. It felt like everything that I was a specialist in, that I had spent my days thinking about, the sources I had made, were suddenly about to become obsolete. And I would need to find something else to do in journalism if I wanted to still have a job, become an environmental writer or something. But very quickly it became clear that it wasn't over, and indeed that the Obama administration was going to have much greater continuity between its counterterrorism policies and those that it had inherited from the second term of the Bush administration than the expectations created by Senator Obama's campaign rhetoric. His incoming Attorney General Eric Holder, his incoming CIA Director Leon Panetta were saying things in their confirmation hearings like, yes, it is lawful and legitimate to hold terrorism suspects without trial under law of war detention. And even though Obama's plan was to close Guantanamo, that plan when you got into the fine print, was to move the same people and hold them in a different prison, not to end the policy that had made Guantanamo notorious in the first place. The CIA director was saying they were still going to use rendition, transferring a captured terrorism suspect to a third country, not his home country, for continued detention or interrogation, based only on diplomatic assurances that that person would not be abused, which was the identical policy to the Bush administration's, at least on paper. They were going to continue using the state secrets privilege in court to battle the same lawsuits that they were inheriting from the Bush administration, when Obama had criticized the use of the state secrets privilege as an abuse under the Bush years, to get rid of cases without adjudications on the merits on matters like surveillance and torture. And of course, we didn't know it then, but we know after Edward Snowden that they were keeping, and indeed without any changes really, entrenching this massive surveillance apparatus that had grown up at the NSA after 9/11 and had gradually become under different legal authorities by the time they took over. In fact, so by as early as February of 2009, I called the White House up and said that I was planning to write a story pointing out that there was going to be greater continuity than expectations. And in one sign of change, if I had called the Bush White House and said I was going to write something that went against their narrative, they would have probably said, you know, we don't care, and hung up the phone. The Obama White House was very attuned and sensitive to this sort of suggestion, and they called me in. And so I went to the White House and I went in to talk to Obama's new White House counsel, Greg Craig, and Dennis McDonough, who now is his chief of staff, one of his most important national security aides. And we had a long conversation in which Craig conceded that there was going to be more, at least at that point, more continuity than maybe some of Obama's left-wing supporters had thought there might be, but also rejected the idea that's already starting to be embraced by some of the Bush crowd, that this amounted to vindication of the Bush policies. He argued that they were going to go slow, they were going to really think about these things, they were going to be careful and deliberate about it, and the fact that they weren't just going to shoot from the hip with bumper sticker slogans and change everything willy-nilly. But he says that doesn't mean we're signing on to the Bush view of the world. That also doesn't mean that, you know, we're abandoning everything, but we just need time to chart our own course. And so it turned out there was going to be lots of stuff to continue to write about for the next few years. And then I started, so I continued to cover Guantanamo and these sorts of things. And eventually I began teaching a course at Georgetown University on Constitution and National Security, co-taught with a recently retired general counsel from the Senate Intelligence Committee. And in the course of designing that class, of thinking about, well, this is going to be surveillance week, this is going to be detention week, this is going to be interrogation week, what are the things that are of enduring, recurring interest in the post-9/11 world where there's constantly frictions arising? What is it you need to know about these issues that are sort of in play in the post-9/11 world so that you're an educated person even if you're not a lawyer? You know, what are the things, what are the court cases that have governed these things? What is it, if you have absorbed the next time there's a terrorist suspect who's captured and suddenly people are on CNN arguing about whether that person should be taken to Guantanamo or given a civilian trial, whether or when they should be read the Miranda warning, that they have a right to a lawyer and that anything they say might be used against them, and so forth. And people are yelling at each other on TV, but they're yelling at it out of context. What is it that if you've been through our class, you would understand, and you'd understand what you're looking at and who's, you know, being accurate and honest about it and who's being just political and exploitative about it. Designing that class, and then this, helped me reach the conclusion that there really ought to be a book about this topic. And I've organized the book sort of in a similar way to the class. You know, there's thematically, in other words, as opposed to chronologically, surveillance chapters, detention chapters, and so forth. But also, I had all this access. You know, I'm fortunate to work for the New York Times. I've been writing about these issues long enough that people trust me to be someone who would get it right and try to really get down in the weeds. And that gave me an ability to know, especially if I went asking the questions, what was happening behind the scenes. We know that the government decides to kill bin Laden and does, but or at least we know that they killed bin Laden. but what was the decision-making process like behind that? What were the issues that were arising that were causing people to argue with each other even though they were on the same ideological team? What were the disagreements? What was seen as at stake? Why was this thing a dilemma that had no perfect answer, and so they went with this imperfect answer instead of that imperfect answer? So I wanted to fill the book as well with not just the abstract stuff that you need to know to be an educated person, but also real-world stories demonstrating how, when these issues arise, people whose job it is to try to run the government and protect national security struggle with them, and the precedents that they know they're creating, whether they act or don't act, and they can't help creating, and the sort of brave new world we're in which so much is different. So much is different in the post-9/11 world because the rules governing what the government can do, individual rights versus the state, what the president can do versus Congress, what the United States can do versus the rest of the world, were not written for the situations that we're encountering now. The laws of war were written for armies of nation-state actors wearing uniforms meeting on a literal battlefield. They were not written for a war against a non-state actor that doesn't wear uniforms, that flows into areas of chaos and ungoverned spaces around the world, that splinters and morphs and doesn't have the same kind of command and control structure that we associate with a normal army. The laws of surveillance were written for analog circuit-based telephone systems, not for the internet, which works very differently. And so you have judges, often in secret, trying to apply these, or executive branch lawyers, trying to apply the old rules to these new situations by analogy. And there's a lot of play in the joints there and a lot of room for disagreements or misunderstandings. And that's part of what makes this era so fascinating. And then the final thing I wanted to do in this book and in the sort of my work in general is to not just tell this series of fly-on-the-wall stories and convey the sort of what I thought was the important takeaways of these different topics that all swirl around what the rules are going to be in post-9/11 America, but also answer a couple big picture questions. The biggest of them is the recurring accusation that Obama betrayed his campaign promises to change George W. Bush's global war on terrorism, and that he ended up acting like Bush. What does that mean? We hear that all the time. The ACLU, has been saying that for years. And what does that mean? What is it? In what way is he acting like Bush? What does it mean to act like Bush? Is it true if you define acting like Bush one way versus another? Why did he end up keeping so many of these things that people thought he was going to jettison when he came in? And I came up with a few takeaways, one, not all of which I'll get into here, but one of which was, in retrospect, we can see now, much more clearly than was the case at the time, that during the Bush administration, when policies like warrantless surveillance and torture, military commissions came to light, and all this criticism arose, mostly on the left or center, but to some extent along the libertarian wings of the right as well, there were two very different strands of criticism that were entangled together. There was a rule of law critique and there was a civil liberties critique. So the civil liberties critique says these policies are inherently wrong. The state should not have the power to wiretap someone's phone calls without going to a judge and showing probable cause. The state should not have the power to prosecute someone in a military court where they don't get the same due process protections as a regular civilian trial and so forth. And that's the rule of law critique says whether or not these policies are the right ones, given the challenges of the 21st century in terrorism, the President Bush went about creating them the wrong way. He broke the law. A federal statute said you have to get a warrant to wiretap on U.S. soil, and he said in secret, I'm the commander-in-chief, I can ignore that statute or disregard it. And that's not how the United States works. If the president thinks the law no longer makes sense, given new situations, the president has to go to Congress and persuade lawmakers to change the law. The president doesn't get to say he's the commander-in-chief and therefore doesn't have to obey the law. And the difference between these two critiques, Bush is violating the rule of law, Bush is violating civil liberties, is that the only way to fix the civil liberties problem is to stop doing that thing. But you can fix the rule of law problem by getting Congress to adjust the law. And in fact, in Bush's second term, there was a lot of changes to the legal basis for these policies. Congress passed statutes like the Military Commissions Act, the FISA Amendments Act, which Obama voted for as a senator, that brought affirmative legal authority for these policies which had previously been forbidden by statute. And we know now that behind the scenes, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was also passing or approving some very novel legal theories that, at least on the surface, rooted policies that had previously been happening unilaterally in an interpretation, a disputed one, it would turn out, of a federal statute, but at least it was claimed at least to be rooted in the law with court oversight and with the intelligence committees in Congress eventually briefed about its existence. And so if you're centered on the rule of law critique, if acting like Bush means breaking the law, the rule of law problems with a lot of these policies had been drained away by January of 2009, even though the civil liberties problems, if you thought they were there, were more or less unchanged. And the second part of this insight is that Obama and the people that he surrounded himself are extremely lawyerly. Obama, unlike Bush and Cheney, Obama and Joe Biden are both lawyers. Unlike Bush and Cheney, Obama and Joe Biden surrounded themselves with fellow law school graduates in policy-making roles. Just look to the State Department, for example. Condi Rice, Colin Powell, the two Bush secretaries of state, neither of whom are lawyers. Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, the two Obama secretaries of state, both lawyers. And that replicates into White House chief of staff roles, into national security advisor roles, into policy-making roles throughout the upper ranks of the executive branch. And part of this, the lawyerly mindset that resulted from this unusual concentration of lawyers at the top of the Obama administration was they were overwhelmingly prone to seeing the problem with Bush as being a rule of law problem. And if you go back into transcripts of what they were saying in real time during the Bush years, and they're at panel discussions and so forth, they're sitting next to people making the civil liberties critique, but they're not the ones making that critique. They're the ones saying the president doesn't get to violate statutes. And so that means that the people who are saying Obama is acting like Bush and the people in the Obama administration who are saying no, we're not, are to some extent talking past each other. And Obama's hands are not entirely clean in that respect, because during the campaign, he was, especially in 2007, he's seeking the Democratic nomination against Hillary Clinton and others, which means he's seeking the affections of a liberal base which is incensed about Bush. And some of the liberal base that's incensed about Bush of the Democratic Party has the rule of law mindset in mind. Many of them have the civil liberties critique in mind. And Obama speaks in a way, because he's trying to win that election against Hillary Clinton, not yet against Mitt Romney, speaks in a way in which he's criticizing what Bush did without making clear, unless you go back in time with this insight and parse what he's saying, that he was criticizing how Bush put these policies in place far more than he was criticizing the policies themselves. So, for example, one of the stories I tell in the book, which predates this administration, is when Obama is going to go to deliver a major national security policy speech in 2007 in Washington at the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is the place where the sort of young first-term senator is going to try to present a unified foreign policy view and try to get the world to take him seriously as someone who could, in fact, be commander-in-chief. And among the things he's going to say, according to an early draft of the speech that his team is writing for him, is he's against military commissions, period. And Jay Johnson, who is one of his close campaign advisors and goes on to be the Defense Department General Counsel in Obama's first term, and then now is Homeland Security Secretary, of course, says, whoa, you don't want to say something that's that black and white, because you might be president, and once you're president, you might encounter situations in which you might need more flexibility than you understand today. You want to leave the door open to deciding what you want to do once you're in that role. And so they changed the speech so that Obama says, I'm against the Military Commissions Act, the 2006 statute that Congress has just passed to legalize military tribunals after the Supreme Court had struck down the first version of them. And so that's what Obama says. And I think a casual listener of that speech would go away thinking he's against military commissions. But actually, he's just against those that were authorized by that statute. And then Congress passes a different one in 2009, and he's able to say, well, that's fine. I'm not acting like Bush anymore, or I'm not doing that thing I said I wouldn't do, because my military commissions are different. But you wouldn't know that as a voter unless you were really paying close attention with a degree of suspicion in your mind. So that's Obama was a politician. That's part of the explanation. The other explanation, though, continues is not just that the statutes have been corrected and so forth by the time he becomes president, but it's also what do they do when they encounter new situations or information they didn't have during the campaign. So another story that I tell in the book, one of these sort of behind-the-scenes things, is where was it that Obama learned about the NSA's bulk phone records collection program, the program Snowden reveals in 2013, where the NSA is collecting records of every American's domestic phone call activity and storing them for 5 years and searching them in the hunt for hidden associates of terrorism suspects. So this, obviously, when Snowden reveals this, it causes this uproar, and it turns out there's not political support in Congress for it. And eventually, earlier this year, Congress passes a law that gets the government out of the business of collecting and storing everyone's calling records in bulk. But the revelation that Obama had kept this was in 2013 was one of those great Obama's acting like Bush moments. So how does it that came to be? Obama learned about that program just after noon on February 6, 2009. When he attended a briefing for him mostly by the sort of permanent members of the national security bureaucracy in the government about the surveillance programs that he had inherited from George W. Bush that he didn't know about yet. And the briefing was mostly conducted by Ben Powell, who was then the holdover general counsel to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He tells Obama is late. We know or we can strongly infer that the risk of a terrorist attack was on his mind because Dick Cheney had just attacked him in public for removing the CIA's black site interrogation program, saying he was increasing the risk that a terrorist attack of catastrophic scale would succeed in the United States. And later that afternoon, Obama was scheduled to go meet with family members of the 9/11 attacks who were mad at him because he had frozen military commission trials at Guantanamo. So Obama shows up. Everyone's waiting for him around the table in this Situation Room. He's late. He's chomping nicotine gum. He goes around, he shakes hands with everybody, most of whom are meeting him for the first time, and then they brief him. And among the things they brief him about is, by the way, the NSA is collecting records of everyone's phone calls. And they further go on to say, Bush created this right after 9/11 as part of this broader set of secret surveillance and data collection programs known as the Stellar Wind program. The warrantless wiretapping thing, which had come to light, was a piece of it, but that was just a piece. It turns out there were these other pieces. And when Bush created it, sir, it was unilateral. It did not have a statutory basis. In fact, it probably conflicted with the statute. And he was saying, as the commander-in-chief, he can trump it. But in between then and now, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court had issued this secret ruling that said, well, no, from now on, it's authorized by this creative interpretation of the Patriot Act. We're going to oversee it. We're going to brief the intelligence committees about it. We're going to issue orders to the phone companies requiring them to turn it over and imposing certain rules about what can and can't be done with the data, how it can be searched, how it can't be searched. And so the rule of law problem has been resolved. And there's some problems living up to those rules that have just come out, but we're fixing them. And this program is very important, and it could have stopped 9/11 if we had had it, which is a claim that would later come under pretty sharp scrutiny, but that's what they said to him. And Obama says, okay, and he points to Greg Craig, his new White House counsel, on his left, and he points to Eric Holder, just sworn in as Attorney General, on his right, who also are learning about this for the first time. And he says, I'm comfortable with what you're telling me, but I want my lawyers to take a look. So at this point, he's sort of made the decision, we're going to keep this program pending unless my lawyers have an objection. I don't know that it's clear to Obama at that point that he actually was being asked to make the decision, are you going to keep this or jettison it? Because it was relayed to me, it wasn't like, sir, would you like to keep this or not? It was, here's a tool that's been in place for many years, it has a strong legal basis, it's really necessary, we're fixing some little problems with it. But that implicitly was what was happening. And they don't come back and tell him that he needs to revisit that implicit decision. I talked to Greg Craig on the record about why that was, and he said to me, well, look, I'm a former public defender. Eric Holder is a former federal prosecutor. We both are used to court cases in which The police have used a PIN register to get records of a criminal suspect's phone calls. And we know that you don't need a full Fourth Amendment warrant to get that kind of information, because way back in 1979, the Supreme Court held that when you expose to the phone company who you're calling, you have no expectation of privacy over that information. And therefore, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply. So it seemed like the constitutional issues had long since been settled. And even though that case involved one person's phone calls for a couple days, not everyone in the country's for 5 years, the reasoning behind it didn't turn on volume. And it seemed very important that the intelligence court had gotten involved and made these legal reforms to it. And so this was not a rogue program. We just needed to bring it up into compliance, not get rid of it. And that's an example of this lawyerly mindset in work. What is the potential problem with this program? Is there legal authority for it? Yes. Do we just need to get it in compliance with it? Yes. It's not, is this something the government should be doing? Does this violate privacy? Is this un-American, whether or not there's legal authority for it? That's how that happened. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but at least we can understand now what seemed inexplicable to many people in the summer of 2013 when the program comes to light. And it's like, how is Senator Obama, the liberal constitutional law specialist who was going to change George W. Bush's war on terror, the president who's presided over this and now seems to be defending it from the White House? So for that, let me stop lecturing and shift to a question and answer. If anyone has any questions, I'd love to keep engaging. Bobby.
Start us off. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So you've been steeped in the legal debates surrounding counterterrorism policy in particular and other policies for a long time now. I teach this stuff, and I find a lot of times my students come up to me at the end of the course, sometimes at the beginning, and say, I don't think it really matters. I mean, it's clear that people feel they have to talk about it and have to go through the forums, and you've got to have lawyerly debates. But at the end of the day, the end result is they do what they want to do. We intervene in Libya, we intervene in Syria, we do this, we do that. What is your view on whether the legal debates are actually impacting policy as opposed to just being this sort of kabuki theater we feel as an American litigation culture we've got to go through?
So for those, could everyone hear his question? Is executive branch lawyering real? Does it actually matter? Or is it just kabuki that the president's going to do what he wants to do anyway, and this is just sort of to make it look nice, but the lawyers will always come up with a theory that lets him do whatever he wants to do? Hugely important question, and one that I struggle with. So it's clear that the Bush administration, which was perhaps the least lawyerly administration ever, at least in his first couple of years, if Obama administration is government by lawyer, they're a government by Wild West, right? And part of the reason for that is none of them are lawyers, and the few lawyers that they do let into the room tend to be, especially around the 9/11 era, people who embrace this sweeping theory of the Constitution, whereby the commander-in-chief cannot be bound by laws and treaties when he's doing what he thinks is necessary to protect national security. So that once you embrace that theory, there's no real reason to think about the law much more, because whatever the issue is, the commander-in-chief override trumps. This administration has been the opposite of that. Not just they're all lawyers, and so they're all used to thinking about things through a legal lens and interested in what the legal issues are, but they try to stay away from that theory. And so they would have tremendous, long deliberations about what the law is in a certain situation, where the Bush administration would write the 2-page memo that says, you're the commander-in-chief, you can do X. They would write the 100-page memo that agonizes over every permutation and every possible objection and has every footnote in its place, and yet very often at the end of the day says, well, maybe we can't always do X, but in this particular X that's in front of you now, you can do X. So does that make a difference? Because at the end of the day, the government is doing X. And I talked to 150 at least current and former officials when I was researching this book, and that's a question I asked a lot of them, because I was struggling with it. And the pushback is, yes, it does make a difference for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes the lawyers do say no. Guantanamo would be closed today if the lawyers didn't have a problem or a hesitation on moving prisoners despite a federal statute that says you shouldn't move them into the United States. The last Iraq war prisoner, a guy named Doc Duke in 2011, would have been brought here and put on trial, except the lawyers couldn't figure out a way to make that legal without violating Iraq's sovereignty. And there's several other examples like that through the book. Not a lot, though. I couldn't find that many. And I did find exceptions where they really did seem to be coming up with creative lawyering to get around the most obvious interpretation of the law. The Libby example that Bobby referenced is one of them. But even if there aren't that many examples, there's further argument was a little bit more subtle, that the process itself of going through this really rigorous lawyering was an end to itself, that it shaped and disciplined the decision-making process and moved it towards a direction often where there wasn't going to be an X that could be a problem. Because even if at the end of the day the president really wanted to do X, okay, but it pushed him in a direction away from X. So, for example, in telling the story of the lawyering behind the bin Laden raid, they think bin Laden is in this compound in Abbottabad. One answer, the easiest answer, might have been simply to bomb it to smithereens, to bomb it so hard that any tunnels underneath would be destroyed as well, kill everyone in it. The problem with that was, unlike most targeted killing strikes which take place in rural Yemen or the mountains of Pakistan where there's one guy in a car on a mountain road or something and not many people around, Abbottabad was a populated neighborhood. The compound was surrounded by other innocent people in their houses who had no idea what was going on. And if you had that amount of bombing on the compound, you were going to flatten the block. You were going to kill dozens, maybe more than 100 civilian bystanders. Now, the law of war allows, in a wartime situation, the intentional killing, as an incidental byproduct of what your goal is, some civilian collateral damage. It has to be necessary, it has to be proportionate to a legitimate military aim, and the lawyers were prepared to sign off on quite a lot of civilian bystander deaths because in the 9/11 war, killing the leader of Al-Qaeda was of overwhelming military objective. But still those discussions about, well, what about these civilian casualties? How much is acceptable? How much would be too much? Discipline the conversation to focus on the amount of carnage that would be caused by that. And the policymakers wrestled with collateral damage, not just from a legal lens, but also then from a policy lens. Is this the best idea? Would this, taint everything? Would we be accused of a reckless operation in which we killed a lot of innocent people, and then because the compound is rubble, no one can really verify that Osama bin Laden was even there, and the whole thing would be viewed as a botching, and then that would get us back to this sort of propaganda fight over the civilian deaths, and it moves the conversation toward what about a more surgical raid instead of a heavy bombing. So he doesn't get to the point where the X that the lawyers sign off on is the most extreme possible X. So that's another example in which how the lawyering, having robust lawyering does make a difference even if there seems to be places where it came under tension. I'm not necessarily endorsing all of this, but I'm saying I had the same question and that was the best answer that was presented to me. And then you.
Charlie, your theory about the two baskets of the rule of law concerns and the civil liberties concerns being two distinct overlapping ones with the Bush era policies and then how the Obama folks addressed the one not more than the others, it strikes me as plausible. But one thing I didn't hear you say at all, I'm just curious about how much this factor may have, or these two related factors may have played into the Obama administration's shift to more aggressive CT stuff, would be the threat assessment and then risk tolerance, particularly going from being a candidate to then being president-elect to being president, as well as the threat assessment of just once you're president-elect, you're getting more intel briefings and your first day in, when you're getting your first PDB, you're really getting a deep dive. My impression from conversations with friends in the Obama administration over the years is that those were pretty important factors in terms of, as they put it, just realizing the terrorist threat, if you will, is more severe, is more grave than we had necessarily realized before. But then second, just the risk tolerance that comes with taking the oath of office and now being commander-in-chief and knowing that at the end of the day, you are held responsible, fairly or not, for what happens on your watch with American security. And not that anyone wants to, tolerate a lot of risk of a terrorist attack, but all of a sudden that goes down to just minuscule. I mean, you will do everything possible you can to prevent this from happening, and that may change your calculation of what are tolerable policies or not. But that's my understanding was a big factor. But am I wrong here?
No, you're absolutely right. And this goes into the calculation of, well, this tool is legal, and so maybe it has some civil liberties problems or not, but it's legal, so why would we not use it? So I think there's two sort of important moments. there's a series of compromises that take place early in 2009 when they come in and they suddenly realize that there's going to be a lot of people at Guantanamo, not just a few, who cannot be given trials but seem like they're genuinely dangerous. And they're not willing to tolerate the risk of just letting them go. And because there's so many of them, that's when Obama decides, well, we're going to keep indefinite detention as an available tool. And there's a few other sort of early compromises like that in this sort of ambiguous first year he has, where he seems to be reforming with one hand and keeping with the other hand. And it's, people focus on whichever part they like or don't like to the exclusion of the other, and it's kind of hard to see where he's going. And then I think what is the most pivotal moment in the Obama administration for how things turn out is and I open the book with this, is the Christmas 2009 underwear bombing attack on a Detroit-bound airliner, where a Nigerian terrorist working with Al-Qaeda's Yemen branch nearly kills 300 people over Detroit on Christmas Day. And it's only sheer luck that the bomb he's been wearing in his underwear doesn't go off. All the systems failed. And so I call this, the opening chapter reconstructs that day from when he's about to try to blow up the plane to when the FBI reads him his Miranda rights, which becomes a huge controversy later. And then I do some big picture stuff in chapter 2. And chapter 3 picks up from December 26th and takes you to February 2010, which is the worst month of the Obama administration for national security policy, where basically everything they've been trying to do falls apart. And they have this a great hardening of their approach to dealing with these issues. And part of that is the visceral internal reaction among Obama and among the political people around him, not the national security professionals who are already focused on it, where it becomes not that this almost happened on his watch, 300 people almost died, that, of course, they all knew intellectually that Al-Qaeda was still out there. The war on terror wasn't over just because he had become president, but now they felt it viscerally in a way that they had not before. And then that's externally, the politics of national security become ferocious. So just a year earlier, in November of 2008, Obama sweeps to this historic victory. Democrats suddenly have 60 votes, a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And it seems sort of like they're a juggernaut, and the Republican Party is in shreds. And the treating of the reading of Miranda rights to Abdul Muttalib, coupled with the decision to bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other 4 9/11 defendants to New York for a civilian trial, suddenly creates this new, after the wave of fear caused by the Christmas attack, creates this new political environment where even Democrats in New York don't want the trial there anymore, and political support for it evaporates. And Obama is forced to put a moratorium on transfers of low-level Guantanamo detainees to Yemen, and because there's something like 70 or 80 of the Gitmo detainees are Yemenis, that means he's not going to succeed in closing Gitmo. And the administration's being buffeted by the sense that they're treating terrorists as criminals. They start internally playing around with ideas like gutting Miranda rights, which is something even Bush didn't try to do. And by the end of that month, they are moving towards what will become probably the most controversial thing Obama does, which is deciding to target and kill an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who they believe was behind that attack, without a trial. And so that moment, and I talked to people, some of them on the record, who briefed Obama and talked about how in 2009, he would receive what they were telling them, but he was focused on the economy, he was focused on healthcare reform. After the Christmas '09 bombing, his ability to tolerate risk, as you say, goes way down, because they see that a successful terrorist attack on the US soil on their watch, not only would people die, but it would destroy their presidency. It would destroy everything they were trying to do, not just national security things like trying to get away from big footprint ground occupations in the Middle East, or not torturing people anymore, but even unrelated things like extending health insurance. Obama would be a failed one-term president, and everything they were trying to do would be discredited and reversed. And so Obama says to his national security team, in this long meeting I recount, where they have to go through everything that went wrong to allow this guy onto the plane, this can't happen again. It's going to be strict scrutiny from now on, which means people will be fired even if they didn't do anything wrong if something like this happens again. And at that point on, the voices of reform inside the administration get quieter, and the voices of we got to keep this power, we got to not release this Guantanamo detainee, we got to not tell the public what we're doing with the Patriot Act, get much louder and have much greater influence. And all that goes down to risk. I said you could be next, sir.
In your response to Bobby, you cited Gitmo as one example of the rule of law thing, where you said the lawyers haven't found a way, to be able to shut it down, move the people to America in violation of clear present law. How do you see that playing out in the remaining months of his administration?
So the question is, now there is a federal statute that Obama signed under protest, but did sign, that says the military cannot bring Guantanamo detainees into the United States for any purpose, not because they're in a medical emergency, not to prosecute them in a civilian court, not to hold them in a different prison. And Obama's plan to close Gitmo requires bringing about 60 people, some of whom are law of war prisoners who just will never get trials but still seem dangerous, a small number of whom are facing military commissions charges, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and will never be let go, to a different prison here, like Leavenworth in Kansas, or Charleston in South Carolina, or Florence, where the federal supermax is. And this is what sort of a remaining issue on Obama's punch list of things he said he wanted to do. He's clearly thinking about his presidential library and biographies and histories yet to be written. And will they say he said with fanfare he was closing Gitmo and totally failed to do it? Or will they say took him longer to do it than he wanted, but he got it done by the time he left office? He clearly wants to get it done. Congress clearly is not going to change the law to facilitate that. And that is raising this, and Obama in general has gotten more aggressive and unilateral as he's evolved. In the beginning, the foil was Bush and Cheney, and he didn't want to be Bush and Cheney. He was going to show that you could respect the role of Congress and work with lawmakers to achieve your policies. Over time, the foil has shifted to the Republican obstructionism, as the Tea Party caucus in the House and now the Senate, preventing the legislative branch from acting at all to get things done, even when there's majority support for them. It starts with the Libya war, I think, as I recount in the book, but it moves heavily into domestic policy, immigration, executive actions, and so forth, which have all been very controversial. So that raises the question, and there's been floating of this. Greg Craig, who I mentioned, now no longer his White House counsel, but wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post just a week ago saying, we think he's the commander-in-chief. Congress cannot impose restrictions on where the commander-in-chief during a war decides is the best place to hold or move wartime prisoners. That's beyond the ambit of Congress. And so he has the authority, he should just move them. Obama has been coy about that, and the White House has been coy. They've not taken it off the table, but they say, well, we're going to keep working with Congress. I don't see Congress changing the law. I don't think he knows what he's going to do either yet. Some of it probably turns on who wins the election next November. What would be the point of doing it if President Trump is just going to move them back a month later? But maybe President Hillary Clinton would say, okay, that was controversial, but they're here now. Let's not reopen Gitmo. And does he want to go out as the president who made this Bush-like claim or not? It's certainly worth watching. I think one of the most fascinating in-play issues. And in fact, part of some of my stuff in this book, if you're interested, is they've actually been arguing about versions of this question internally since January of 2010. There's been a long internal argument where even they don't agree about Congress's ability to tie the president's hands or not. And because he hasn't acted except with the Bergdahl prisoner exchange, when he moved 5 Taliban guys out without following a law that said he had to wait 30 days but claimed that the law didn't apply in this emergency. He's largely acquiesced to date to these restrictions, but pressure is really mounting on the dilemma he faces. Yes, sir.
First of all, Truth and Advertising, I'm the CIA officer representative. I have a question about you were just getting at the Congress, and that's my question.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about two-term presidents, so now we're talking about, coming up on 16 years of governance. And I'm not addressing, this is going to be kind of a naive question, but can we expect Congress to do anything ever? And I'm not talking about something as controversial as Gitmo, but going back to your point about like the language on wiretapping or something like that and how antiquated The things that were revealed by Snowden, I think the narrative, American people didn't really understand that narrative, and the closest thing they got to understanding it was the debate in Congress last spring, where they actually had to decide with all this what they were going to do. We really haven't had that debate at the national level on risk versus civil liberties, if you put the lawyer part aside a little bit. I mean, is there any, if you stayed away from the closed Gitmo kind of conversation, could we make any progress on that based on what you've seen in covering this issue? And is there any appetite for that at all? And do we need it? Do we need to review the basic legislation underlying some of these things?
Well, so the question is, can we have a legitimate debate in Congress that meaningfully?
Congress ever address the issue of the air gap between the language and the interpretation, and maybe close some of that? It will never resolve all of these. Bobby's question, I got that.
I mean, Congress is a depressing institution to watch, regardless of your political views. They seem quite uninterested and unable or unwilling to engage in these issues. Right now, we're getting deeper and deeper into a war in Syria, and Obama said, well, this is part of the 9/11 war because ISIS used to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Now they are against each other. But I think no one could plausibly say that when Congress authorized war in September of 2001, they thought they were authorizing a war against the Islamic State in Syria. And the reason Obama made that controversial interpretation, and it's another one of those stories in the book, is because he thought Congress wouldn't act. He thought Congress just can't tie its shoes. They were going to go home for the 2014 midterm. It was August, September of 2014. And they, whenever he asked for something, they don't want to give it to him. And Boehner, I think, said they weren't even going to take it up. And meanwhile, there was a pressing need to save these people on this mountain who were about to be slaughtered by the Islamic State. And so he comes up with this sort of arguably slightly cynical legal interpretation that allows him to at least take action. And it's controversial, and yet a year now and a half has passed, and Congress has an ample opportunity to take up an AUMF and just won't. It just won't do it. And so what is supposed to happen in a situation where Congress won't do its job? It won't decide these questions. Another thing that drives me crazy is, to this day, it is unknown whether it is lawful for the government to seize an American citizen on U.S. soil and say he's a terrorist and hold him as an enemy combatant in a military brig. Bush did that to Jose Padilla, and one appeals court said it was not lawful, and the other appeals court said it was lawful, and it was going to go to the Supreme Court, and it got resolved when he sent the guy back to the regular court system without a definitive ruling. And we don't know, right? And that raises major rule of law and civil liberties issues. It would be nice to at least to know what the rule is. And Congress has had numerous examples of opportunities to at least cast a vote, write it down in a statute. Maybe a court system would approve it or not approve it, but at least make the law, because your job is to be lawmakers, and they won't do it. It's just it's clown show. And so what happens when that branch of government is just not engaged or is disabled by their internal divisions from acting? That's a dilemma of this time, and I wish it were not so, just as an American. I promised I'd go backwards. Yes, sir.
So you've made a couple of references to Guantanamo, and the administration's narrative on Guantanamo has sort of been that they'd like to close it, but Congress keeps passing laws that won't let them close it. Do you think, is that, based on your experience, is that a legitimate narrative, or is this more the administration has just found a lot of reasons that it's convenient not to close it?
Well, because the administration's plan for closing it involves bringing everyone they don't want to let go here and holding them in the Florence Supermax or holding them in Leavenworth or whatever, therefore not making the sort of harder decision of, do you let everyone go that you can't give a trial to? I think it's correct that the statute is the main impediment to closing it, with the sort of query, is that really closing it or is that just moving it? That said, there was also, I think Obama himself would now acknowledge, he made a huge mistake. He said, I'm going to do this, and he didn't do it. I mean, part of this was this sort of lawyerly, deliberate, not shooting from the hip approach they had coming in 2009. Yeah, we're going to close Guantanamo, but first we're going to have a long review of everyone who's there. We're going to have a task force to think about detainee policies, as Bobby was on a member of, and we're going to really think through this carefully. And then a year passes, and it's like a piñata up there, and people can just keep whacking it until it's totally in shreds, and political winds shift because there's an underwear bombing and whatever. And similarly, he said, we're going to bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the Gitmo guys involved in 9/11 to New York and indict them and have a trial there in the normal court system, which functions quite smoothly, unlike the military commission system. But they didn't do it. They just said it. And then 2 months pass, and the political winds shift, and suddenly it's too hard. And part of this is a lesson in just being an effective president, and he said things like this himself, so I'm not criticizing him, but more, describing accurately, which is something I think he'd agree with. He should have just moved them. Once he said we're going to move them, he should have said, put them all in Fort Leavenworth by the end of January 2009, and then we'll figure out which buckets to put them in. Or once you say you're going to prosecute these guys in civilian court, put them on a plane and bring them to New York and create a new fact on the ground, but don't just sort of let this thing linger. And so that by January of 2011, 2 years later, the winds have shifted and Congress includes this restriction on bringing them into US soil, and he sort of signs it with reluctance. It's on him that he didn't do it in those first 2 years when that law did not exist. How the far back?
You kind of touched on this earlier when you mentioned Anwar al-Awlaki. I was wondering if you read the DOJ's justification for targeted killing, it's pretty straightforward. And I know nothing about legal scholarship, but it seems like they don't have a very hard time justifying the targeted killing of an American citizen. So if that's the case, why was it that the Bush administration shied away from doing that? Was it purely for an issue of public support, that they didn't think that they would have the public support to target an American? Or was it in fact a very kind of heated, complex legal debate over whether they had the right to?
So the question is, why didn't Bush kill al-Awlaki? And the answer is al-Awlaki evolves. Al-Awlaki doesn't, at first al-Awlaki is a propagandist. He makes YouTube videos and delivers sermons and has writings saying, jihad is good and the West is bad, and I celebrate that attack that someone just did. He would be out there saying, yay, Paris, that was awesome. But that's different than he himself coming up with a plot and taking someone who's come to him for guidance and saying, you should really put on this suicide bomb and get on that plane to Detroit. So they say that he evolves into an operational terrorist who's actually coming up with specific plots and sending people to attack rather than just sort of cheerleading from the side in late 2009. And it's the evidence, especially the underwear bomber who survives when he tells the FBI in January 2010 it was al-Awlaki, that convinces them that he's no longer this guy, he's that guy. And that, so their legal analysis about why it was lawful to target him if his capture was infeasible turned on the fact that he was sitting there, or the claim that he was sitting there coming up with plots and sort of throwing bombs at us. That was not the factual understanding of him in the Bush years, and so it didn't meet that threshold. Yes, sir.
Also in light that our president received the Nobel Peace Prize during his presidency,
Mm-hmm.
do you think his foreign policy made any substantial strides to peace, or is still a similar to the Bush foreign policy?
Well, he clearly has very different foreign policy than Bush, right? He's wanted to get away from major ground occupation land wars, and he has pulled out of Afghanistan in that respect, and Iraq, and has resisted sending in occupying ground forces, and now that the Islamic State has arisen and is sort of holding the line with airstrikes. So in that sense, he's very different than Bush. That doesn't mean that he's a Nobel Peace, an obvious choice for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. Yes, sir.
I think you're ahead of me.
Let Charlie call his own.
Does the Obama administration deserve any credit for reaching out to those making the civil liberties arguments, whether it's related to torture, or whether it's waterboarding, whether it's secret prisons, whatever? Does it deserve any
I mean, I myself wouldn't say deserve credit or not. You know, I'm trying to stay within my lane, which is explaining. I would say that one thing that's sort of overshadowed by the failure to close Guantanamo and the embrace of indefinite detention for that very difficult to deal with cohort of prisoners he inherited was how different his policy is for future captives, newly captured terrorism suspects, and how he's tried very hard, even though he's not renouncing military authority as a tool that's available when needed, he's trying to use it as a last resort. And so we have not seen him send anyone new to Guantanamo, and he's resisted very much holding people in long-term indefinite detention who are captured on his watch. And has, you know, come up with what would they call the Warsami model off of the first one who was treated this way. Instead, come up with a sort of hybrid approach where they can be interrogated for intelligence purposes, not with torture, but without a lawyer present either, for 30 or 60 days, and then get put into the normal court system for a regular trial, and which works very well. And these guys either cooperate greatly or go off to Florence and are never heard from again, and you don't have the agonies of Guantanamo and military commissions as a means of dealing with them. And you know, part of that is because the law was changed after 9/11 to expand the scope of material support for terrorism so that it applied to non-citizens abroad. And as a result, it's now easier for people who are not Americans and who are picked up in Afghanistan or whatever to be charged with that offense, which can get you a life sentence, even if you can't be tied to some specific attack just because you were helping Al-Qaeda. The problem is that law did not apply to non-citizens abroad before the Patriot Act. And so people that we were grabbing in the fall of 2001 in Afghanistan who were part of Al-Qaeda but didn't do anything specific. You know, they got some training at a camp and seemed to be committed ideologically, but they're not tied to some attack. It's not clear what federal civilian court statute that violated that was in existence at the time. And of course, some of them also were tortured, and that tainted the evidence as something that could be admissible in court against them. But if now this material support law is expanded, now the government is not torturing people it captures, and so there's no particular reason why civilian court can't be used to incapacitate detainees over the long term. So he has a very, very different policy for future captures than the Bush administration had. And that just gets overshadowed because he's still dealing with this cohort at Gitmo that he inherited. Mm-hmm.
So
One more? Last one.
Bush-Obama comparison. Again, Bush and Cheney, as you point out in your first book, were very much calling the shots and using the law as a tool when they used it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Done what they wanted. This group you portray as lawyerly, team of lawyers thinking it through. And the role of the president in all this doesn't come out very clearly yet. Maybe it doesn't in the book, but maybe you need a question to talk about how the president uses the law, whether he considers himself subordinate to it or asks his people to find ways to get done what he wants to get done. How does that work in this administration?
You know, like everything is complicated and doesn't reduce to it's like this or it's like that. I think in general he's the lawyer in chief too, and it's his interests that are driving and shaping this deliberative process in which legal issues and legal ways of approaching problems are going to be front and center. He's the one in that story I told about getting the briefing who says, I'm comfortable with what you're hearing as long as my lawyers don't come across anything that bothers them. So that's himself being a lawyer and approaching that question from a loyalty standpoint. However, you know, I do have unearthed and tell in the book several instances where, you know, he adopted legal reasoning that was arguably not the best interpretation of the law, maybe not off the wall, but it's, you know, not the favored interpretation of even of his legal advisors, in a way that was expedient to solve the problem in front of him. And it's not like it was like that all the time, but it's not like it was never like that either. And you know, being lawyerly has positive connotations sometimes. You really approach things carefully and you grapple with the other side and best arguments and don't just sort of ignore them. And you move slowly and you think through things and you value process. But being a lawyer has negative connotations too, because you can be legalistic and come up with this clever theories for why your side is right, even if no one really agrees with them except your side. And especially in this world where it's rare for anything to come before a neutral judge, and the problems can be severe, and the dilemmas can be real, those pressures sometimes become quite strong. I think I was told that I had to stop, so thank you guys you all for coming to hear me. I appreciate it. If you choose to read the book, I hope you enjoy